Welcome to the yearly visual novel tier list video for 2024. Today I'm going to cover every single visual novel I've read this year, ranking them from the bottom of the barrel to the absolute best of the best, with an awards ceremony at the very end for top personal recommendations. Hi, my name is August and I've reviewed tons of anime visual novels here on the channel. I've read over 150 visual novels, good, bad, and everything in between, and I want to help you find a great visual novel to read. This one's going to be a long video, so sit back and listen, because there's certainly some very interesting titles in here that you might be interested in. We've done this many years before, and this year's no different. So let's start off with a title that combines a time-looping premise with the familiar charms of a typical anime rom-com, but what sets it apart is its unique focus on classical art and artistic expression. Amazing Grace, What Color Is Your Attribute follows an amnesiac main character named Shu as he wakes up in a strange place, a European town enclosed in an aurora. He quickly becomes attached to the town and the new friends he meets, but on Christmas Day, an explosive fire breaks out, engulfing the town and its inhabitants in flames. However, thanks to one desperate wish, he's able to travel back in time a month prior to attempt to save the town and its people from complete catastrophe. Now, while there's a lot to keep this story running, from exploring the intricate mysteries of this unusual town, to understanding the time travel mechanics, to figuring out who the culprit is behind the fire, the story is actually pretty relaxed about the whole problem. Every time loop is dedicated to Shu investigating each of the characters and the heroines in depth, which is basically their character romance route. This is fine normally. The girls are pretty cute in their own right, and there's a bunch of fun antics that they all get up to. The problem is that all of this is happening while the culprit is out there about to light their town on fire. There's no sense of urgency. You think they would be more concerned about all this, but nah, let's just film a movie for the school festival first. Although, I find that the biggest problem is that the story requires a very big suspension of disbelief when it comes to its plot devices, developments, and reveals. I kinda just took it as accepted fact and continued reading, but it sure had me raising an eye of how everything was handled. As for the rom-com side, I see it as satisfactory. It's simply okay. Well, pardon the cliche rom-com joke bits. It doesn't stand apart from any other rom-com visual novel out there. What does, however, is how Amazing Grace takes time to explore the aesthetics of classical art. Think of it as the visual novel teaching you classical art 101, identifying the meaning and intent behind certain art pieces, questioning what defines aesthetic beauty, and self-reflecting about the expression of oneself through art. It then takes these art principles and uses it to highlight each individual character and their own unique beliefs and motivations. Really, Amazing Grace is at its best and most unique in this department, and should be why you read this visual novel, especially if you're looking for a cute romance with a bit of a story to it. Everything else though, from its time travel premise to its rom-com elements, is just passable. C tier. Amanatsu is a classic take on a pure love summertime romance. It's not the most original or outstanding, but sometimes romance lovers just want some simple comfort food, and that's perfectly fine. The story is about our main character Haruto as he escapes to the countryside in the hopes of living a more freeing life away from strict parents and cram school. What he's quickly gonna find out though is that things aren't gonna get dull out here in the countryside, as he meets three girls, each with their own unique personalities. Amanatsu plays it straight for a rom-com. Haruto experiences his new life in the countryside, fun shenanigans happen with the new people he meets, and he grows close to one of the girls, which naturally evolves into a wholesome relationship. It's very much on the comedy side of a rom-com. The jokes and punchlines are very reactionary. Characters will sound off on absurd, wacky behaviors, to which then the others follow up in appropriate responses, plenty of sound effects included. If you are a fan of making lovers, you're gonna find this visual novel very familiar vibe-wise, as it's written by the same author. It's a comedy style that's very hit or miss for people. A giant miss, especially if you're coming in here expecting a drama romance. Now, there are sensitive, emotional moments in here taking place after the relationship is established, but the story won't get too in-depth about it. There's nothing wrong with Amanatsu as a romance title, but it doesn't stand out uniquely premise-wise, nor does it have any exceptional qualities to it. The chibi CGs and animated sprites are cute, but that's about it. Straight up, if you're looking for a cute, relaxing rom-com with wacky comedy, Amanatsu will get the job done. But consider the fact that there are plenty of better alternatives out there. C tier. I'm gonna be straight with you. This is a visual novel that is upfront about what it is all about. For it is for the people who are into the big badongers, the massive malmaries, the giant Dobon honkaroos. One epic title with tons of huge plot. But at the same time, it's a strangely compelling and humorous story about one average knight's comically absurd rise to fame. Funbag fantasy. This enticing story isn't just bouncing bazungas, as it takes your typical fantasy medieval setting with its typical character archetypes. The unassuming hero protagonist, the benevolent ruling king, the evil mustache twirling villain, and it somehow spins together a pretty amusing zero to hero tale. Our main character Lute is a graduate of the Knight Academy, who ended up getting transferred to the boonies due to being last in his class. Luckily for him, his first duty, taking down a deadly succubus, is quickly accomplished after spending one passionate night with her. But that was only the beginning, as this surprise encounter leads him to discover a deadly conspiracy against the royal crown. He's an absolute legend, just by being an all-around likable guy. He's generous, sincere, honest, and likes people, especially women with huge honkers. This normal dude is able to overcome every ordeal thrown at him, just by being himself and having an ungodly luck stat. You might think that Funbag fantasy is just pleasurable gratification, to which it is, especially compared to another, less than wholesome fantasy Eroge I've reviewed in the past, but Funbag fantasy is unexpected in how it will keep your attention. There's a lot of political backstabbing that happens in here, and yet, despite all of the scheming, seeing how Lute is able to come out on top is pretty enjoyable. It's not the most ambitious title story-wise. Remember, you're picking this up for some spicy, wholesome fun time. The fantasy story was just an added benefit to hold you over until the next H scene. And also, if you like this title and its bountiful women, you'll be glad to know that there's plenty more in its sequel titles. Funbag fantasy gets a C. Next up is a very spicy title, an iconic classic about visual novel development, the Eroge about making Eroge through practical experience. Eroge, sex and games make sexy games. Now, this premise isn't fooling anyone. It very much sounds like something you would find out of an adult scenario playbook. I need some help writing this spicy romance scene. How about you come make a story with me? Yes, it's tacky for sure, but the developers also decided to spin it into a very educational experience about Eroge game development. Our main character Tomoya finally succeeds in getting a job at an Eroge game company in hopes of creating what he loves. However, on arrival, he realizes that the company he applied at is on the verge of bankruptcy after the massive failure of their previous game. So, Tomoya decides to teach his female co-workers what makes a game good, as an Eroge consultant. To those wondering about the material, there's plenty of spicy scenarios, each one befitting the unique personalities of each of the girls. The masochist Kisara, the sadist Momoka, the fetishist Iori, and the very not convincing but totally legal age 32-year-old company president Nene. They start out normal enough, and then they escalate very quickly to where I was turned off by how extreme their acts got. There's some standard run-of-the-mill positions, a couple of vanilla scenes, and the next thing I know, BDSM and scat enters the building, and I'm like, no, not today. And yet, despite all of that, there's actually some character development in here with some genuine heart. These guys may be getting each other off to get reference material, but they are ride or die co-workers fully dedicated on making a great game together. You may not realize it, but this title is actually a story about the struggle of an indie game studio just barely making it by. That said, it's not anything too amazing, given the stereotypical character archetypes, quick conflict resolution, and basic arc progression, but it's more than I honestly expected for a spicy Nukige title like this. And to anyone who enjoyed the anime adaptation, you'll very much appreciate seeing the original source material too. C tier. And now, time for a very unique visual novel. Class of 09 is a parody, quote, anti-dating sim game, where in a comically exaggerated 2000s America, you get to see its self-proclaimed sociopath main character release her inner bad white girl. This is a visual novel where you should absolutely not take it seriously. It's edgy, unfiltered humor with very 2000s American crest language and culture from back in the day. There are some outright insane, jaw-dropping antics in here, from our main character Nicole baiting and then locking up pedos, to indirectly causing a white nationalist pride parade, to being a manipulative menace to practically everyone. And yet, despite all of that, there's a certain sting to it. These behaviors are exaggerated, yes, but you could feel it come from a place of frustration as a young teenage girl in school back then. Do I think Class of '09 is some hidden gem? No, not really. Its attempts at parody come off too mean-spirited and self-indulgent, showing a terrible character being praised for her actions half the time on the fact that everyone else is written to be outright worse. The message of, hey anime nerd, I go through tough crap too and no one can understand me, ends up sounding hollow when it's coming from a terrible person, arguably self-proclaimed sociopath. I see Class of '09 as a cheap thrill ride with the intent of virality. It's very good at what it set out to do, while also having some phenomenal voice acting to sell it. Low B tier. Which brings me to its quote-unquote sequel, Reup. Now that Nicole's a senior in high school, you might think that she has grown up from when she was a new transfer student. Absolutely not. She's still on the same shenanigans and drugs as she was before. What's amusing about Reup is that while it may be the same premise of Nicole being a menace, it also unexpectedly explores topics like homelessness, gay and abusive relationships, and selling your body for money. It's for that reason that I like Reup more, for having just a bit more depth, despite it moving away from its more outlandish comedic side compared to the first installment. Although being shot at by police and selling crack for volunteering hours are still just as crazy. I say all that, but again, that's not much of an improvement. Class of '09 is still the same mean-spirited, self-centered tirade of why the world sucks. And while amusing, I'm not a fan. These titles are very low B tier for me. Let me just outright say it. Nie no Hakoniwa is a brutal title. This visual novel's horrific content surpasses the infamous Euphoria and even reaches into maggot baits and sadistic blood levels of grotesque ruthlessness. It sure surprised me. What began as a wholesome arranged marriage between two awkward lovers ended up turning into a complete nightmare, full of scheming conspiracies and mentally deranged people. Nie no Hakoniwa tells the story about how the clan, Haushiki, arranges a young man from outside the family, Kuro Yasuka, to marry their eldest daughter, Kyoko Shiki, in order to have an heir continue their bloodline. Despite living completely different lives from each other, the two arranged lovers were able to overcome their initial awkwardness and develop feelings for one another. But on the day of their wedding, a nightmarish tragedy destroys their lives, all because of a mysterious box given to them as a present. A box used by their ancestors to overthrow their oppressors and establish their family's noble status and prosperity. Reading this was one hell of a horror show, but it sure doesn't appear so at first. Nie no Hakoniwa actually has a lot of moving parts to it. It starts off wholesome enough. There's a compelling romance story in here. The dynamic between a restrained upper-class sheltered lady and the stoic tool for violence in human form guy offers a lot of neat interactions as they fill in the missing parts in each other. It's the I can fix him taken quite literally. Overall, just watching these two interact and go on dates is pretty cute. There's even meaningful depth to it besides them being romantically involved. Nie no Hakoniwa actually provides a bit of interesting commentary on the importance and role of a woman, considering that the story is set in this older time period of Japan where nobility and lineage is considered very important. Now add in rival family clans, different social classes, and state sovereignty, and things get very messy politically. I quite enjoyed seeing all the intricate dealings of these clan relationships. It's just unfortunate that once you hit a certain part in the visual novel, the story turns into this brutal murder revenge plot x actual torture porn. The storytelling takes a major nosedive, where you are just watching pure chaos unfold, people being massacred, slaughtered, and violently pillaged to no end. The shock value is there for sure, but after a while, it's just tiresome to see it all go down. Not to mention the tackiness at seeing every girl turning into a mindless whore halfway through the act. And yet, strangely enough, regardless of the story quality, the brutality and the gore is the most compelling reason why most people are going to read this visual novel. This title is especially noteworthy in showcasing the brutality of it all and showing how messed up things can get. I cover a little bit more of it in my actual review video, but simply put, Every single character in here is their own unique brand of insanity, from violent men-hating women to abusive arranged partners to even human cannibals. Hell, even our own protagonists are a little crazy inside. Note, this is an understatement. If you're a fan of Eroge, this title is absolutely worth checking out. For everyone else though, I hope you have a tough stomach if you do read it. Nie no Hakoniwa gets a B. Now, I'm gonna let you on a little secret. Out of every Nukige I've read, a visual novel solely dedicated on its explicit R18 content, this one is my personal favorite. Not just because of its attractive art style and fantastic visual production, one with really good animated H scenes, but for also telling a very dark, spicy romance story. Bishoujo Mangekyou 1, Noro Watashi Densetsu no Shoujo. Shigehiko, a teacher at an all-female academy, has a passionate love for the girls he meets. He's able to keep his emotions under control until he meets the mysterious, alluring girl Kyrie Kagurino, but his attempts at pursuing her goes far beyond simply crossing the line, as he stumbles upon her true identity as a noble, prideful, and most of all, sadistic immortal vampire. Honestly speaking, this title is one of the more questionable visual novels at a first glance. It's a story that dives deep into a bizarre relationship between two people who really shouldn't be paired together. An ordinary human and an immortal monster, a teacher and his student, and an older guy and a young girl. However, I do have to say, if you fancy the dark gothic romance aesthetic with lots of assertive power dynamics and toxic immoral relationships, I don't think you'll find a better sensual visual novel than this. I'm sorry if you think that's problematic and repulsive, but that's the stuff I just eat up in my dark romance fiction, for that extra spice. Bishoujo Mangekyou 1 has all sorts of rough play in it, extremely sadistic teasing, forceful blood sucking, and of course, a fair amount of BDSM. Kinda like the stuff you would find in 50 Shades of Grey, except with vampires, wine drinking, and arguably way better writing. There's even a fair bit of non-con material, with some rather dubious actions and motivations in here. If you're scared of what I just said prior, you are free to check out some other wholesome vanilla romances. But to those who find themselves intrigued or amused by the immoral nature of it all, and that sense of thrill and exhilaration from taking on bold risks and dangers, will appreciate this story exploring the psyche of those strange individuals through their passionate acts of love. Or if you just love those seductive bloodsuckers. Really, Bishoujo Mangekyou would not be as enjoyable if it wasn't for our female lead. Kyrie is like the perfect blend of crazy sadistic vampire and super cute tsundere. For as much as she's domineering and commanding as she insults and mocks our main character's degeneracy, she's equally bashful and maidenly as soon as she falls into ecstasy. I absolutely love the contrast. Her performance sells it, and her transformation is wild to watch. To those of you who love watching a girl fall deeper and deeper into pleasure, you will be feasting on these H scenes. It is, after all, a Nukige that shows plenty of their cardinal acts. And yet, at the same time, you can also see their relationship constantly evolving too. You get to see how these characters start out at first, so concerned about their upstanding principles and egotistical pride, only to see them eventually change thanks to each other, albeit through their extreme immoral acts in their weird, twisted relationship. A balancing act as these two constantly wonder, are they seeking each other out of cardinal pleasure or out of compassionate love? These are the reasons why I like this visual novel. It's not exactly your traditional love story, but interesting and amusing to read regardless. Bishoujo Mangekyou 1 gets a B. Milk Inside of a Bag of Milk Inside of a Bag of Milk is a very strange visual novel. It's a psychological Denpa horror game about buying a bag of milk, but the implications are far more than you might imagine. You'll follow this nameless girl as she goes outside to buy milk, and very quickly, you'll begin to understand her unique circumstances. The pixelated visual presentation and the oppressive sounding music actually helps in making you empathize with this girl, and I found it pretty charming. This game's only an hour long, and it only costs $1. But in that limited time period, it presents such a unique experience as you watch this girl as she struggles with her mental illnesses, and help make her day just a little bit better. While this story wasn't for me, I would highly encourage picking up its sequel, Milk Outside of a Bag of Milk Outside of a Bag of Milk, if you enjoyed reading this. B tier. Next up is one of the more intriguing and out there visual novels I've read this year, because this title was on no one's radar. What I initially expected to be just an average NTR story, one that I wasn't even going to mention at all, ended up being something I just had to talk about. Playing Scent of Seductive Flesh had me feeling I was reading a horror story with how much it kept me on my toes. It's not a horror title at all, it's a full-blown drama. The story is about a university student named Takuya who picked up a job as a live-in house tutor for the Misawa family. While living in the house, he notices a hole in the wall in his room that connects to the Misawa master bedroom, an observation that only scratches the surface regarding the many secrets of the Misawa family and their personal affairs. One of the most unique things about Scent of Seductive Flesh is that a good portion of the game involves exploring the house in a 3D environment. Through this, you have the option of exploring extra dialogue interactions by meeting people around the house before progressing the story. It also greatly added to the POV experience, running through the house at night, seeking out individuals to confront them, and overall, being where I was not supposed to be added a sense of both thrill and dread to what should normally just be a simple occurrence of walking through a hallway. What I really appreciate though is how much time you get to connect with the characters. As you grow closer to them, you start to see that some family members aren't as bad as Takuya initially believed, which makes the twists and reveals that much more surprising. It's a story that has you navigate this messy family drama, leaving you to ask, whose side should you take, given you had no part in this family feud to begin with. Every character interaction reveals more about their family dynamics and individual motives, and by the final hours of the game, I was unexpectedly put on edge, just waiting for people to snap. It sure had me reading to see what happened next, and it was very eye-opening at the final reveal. And equally dreadful too. Now, one special note I would like to mention is that the art is definitely worth appreciating. It may have an older art style, but it has this mature, seductive appeal to it. If you're a fan of older women, you'll enjoy the artwork of the CGs in here, especially considering that most of this visual novel's H scenes are animated. To wrap up, I initially said that this was an NTR title, but realistically speaking, there's very little of it. If anything, it really only happens in a couple of the bad endings. So what you'll end up getting is actually a rather interesting and unique family mystery drama, one with a couple surprising rug pulls. That said, if you do end up seeking this game out to read, I would highly recommend using a guide and being careful of the bad endings for spoilers. Scent of Seductive Flesh gets a B. If you're looking for a really unique experience, may I suggest to you Slay the Princess, a short horror game where you are tasked with slaying the princess. But your playthrough may not be as simple and clear-cut as you may think, nor will it match mine or anyone else's. Now, while Slay the Princess appears as a visual novel, it acts more like a choose-your-own-adventure game, where the more choices you pick, the more complex the game gets. It's a branching narrative with lots of dialogue options and physical actions to choose from, where even the most insignificant of choices can lead to a drastic change. While I technically completed the game in 4 hours, I would highly encourage you to go through the game multiple times to see the different variations that Slay the Princess has to offer. I sure did, if only to hear more of the narrator and the different voices. He's my favorite character. I spent lots of time fooling around with him just to hear his irritated wit and sarcasm. It's very similar to the Stanley Parable, as ignoring him can lead to some rather interesting developments. Of course, he isn't the only interesting character, as the princess herself was a very dynamic individual, no matter what form of her I met. Ethereal nightmare, bloodthirsty Oni beast, or female titan god. And the accompanying horror depictions and artwork definitely sold her in the game as a whole. Unfortunately, because of its format, I found the game starting to get repetitive the more I continued to replay it. It makes sense why it's designed like this, but nothing actually changes the formula as a whole. On another note, I do think that some people might find the story hard to understand. Even on my second and third playthrough, it took a bit to parse all of the stylistic poetic speech and each of its endings. But besides those, Slay the Princess is a nice one-off pick-up-and-play horror game to fulfill that Halloween/horror itch. It's a great beginner visual novel for any readers out there, however, it'll be less appealing to the more hardcore veteran visual novel fans out there. B tier. Now, if you're looking for a short occult horror mystery story, may I suggest Paranormasight, The 7 Mysteries of Honjo. It's an investigative mystery visual novel where 9 men and women engage in a battle of wits over a mysterious occult ritual that can resurrect someone from the dead. You'll get to see a lot of different people and their perspectives throughout the story as they make their own individual investigations, sometimes even intertwining with each other's character stories as they pursue their own goals. What's really interesting is how the story does this through meta elements, giving you the ability to provide the characters the knowledge necessary to proceed. I like some of the cheeky out-of-the-box solutions. It's a pretty neat way of making use of the visual novel medium while still tying it into the main story narratively. That first-person perspective as you're looking around the environment investigating for clues is fun, regardless of the game deciding to startle the hell out of me. Although, that's just me being horrible at dealing with jump scares and loud noises. The game's horror presentation is actually pretty spot on. I was vibing with this title all the way through, almost enough to make me forget about the game's lackluster true ending and how shockingly obvious who the mastermind was. I'm aware that the general appeal of a mystery is the ending and figuring out who the culprit is, but a lot of my enjoyment was actually in how these characters interacted and how their personal values and opinions were either changed or solidified thanks to this ordeal and the idea of the rite of resurrection. It may have started out appearing as this death game horror thriller, but I'm a fan of the direction it ultimately decided to take, a slower-paced investigative mystery with character-driven moments. A very nice short game, which I would also recommend as a solid beginner visual novel. A tier. Now, when I finished the first few volumes of Criminal Border, I was very surprised, for I consider it to be a very underrated series, one that not many people have read. Really, I didn't expect to read a crime drama where an otaku loser is forced to topple the underworld through his drug trade. The story begins when our gloomy main character Itsuki accidentally creates a digital hypnotism movie that arouses people's sexual desires. He succeeds in showing the video to his childhood friend Rin, only to discover her hidden side, a cunning opportunist with a call girl business. Rin enlists him and uses his video to make more money, and he agrees, not knowing he would end up running face to face with the Yakuza, where the only way to get out is to beat him at their own game. Criminal Border has an exceptionally strong premise, and with each installment, the stakes gets higher and higher, and our main character Itsuki is forced to adapt and change. He transforms from this geeky otaku shut-in with no friends to rising digital drug lord, fully intent on combating the Yakuza. It's not out of sheer pride and greed too, but rather to protect his newfound family who mean the world to him. Itsuki's characterization was one rapid development I very much enjoyed watching. How Criminal Border positions itself is noble too. As you get to know these young characters, you will get to understand the struggles that they've had to face. Their business might be less than ethical, but they have to do it because they have no other choice. Criminal Border's pacing is also really solid too. There's no downtime. All events are dedicated to progressing our main cast's plans, while trying to figure out how to counter the Yakuza's cunning actions. It sets up our characters as major underdogs, and the story had me rallying behind them with every breakthrough. Now, the series is written through installments, each one focusing on a different heroine and providing its own significant progression while still hooking you to read the next volume. First Offence sets the stage and explores our cast. Meanwhile, Second Offence continues to raise the stakes and furthers our main character's conviction to do what needs to be done no matter the cost. Criminal Border is a pretty cool crime thriller. It seems that the author, Kazuki Fumi, took his experience writing the 9 series and made Criminal Border a pretty engaging story, one where I couldn't wait to read the next volume. It's just that good of a hook. Criminal Border First Offence gets a B, while Second Offence gets an A. Here's a fun fact for you. For this next title, I had actually already watched this as an anime, and now, 12 years later, I was able to experience it in its original form. That title is Mashiroiro Symphony. This is still an emotionally heartfelt romantic story I would highly recommend, and that's not my nostalgia talking. It's a very simple premise. A private girls' school starts taking in boys from a separate school, and understandably, they aren't that happy about it. However, their opinions slowly begin to change due to our main character Shingo deciding to play peacekeeper. That is, until the most renowned and influential girl in the school objects to the change. Again, it's not a very unique or thrilling premise, but it handles its romance very well. While Mashiroiro Symphony is an anime rom-com eroge, the prose makes me feel like I'm reading a shoujo manga instead. The script has its characters be more introspective, highlighting exactly how each individual feels about the other characters and the situation that they're in. They are very conscious about their surroundings, how they are viewed by others, and that affects how they act. Every one of their actions has both good and bad consequences, and it ends up changing relationship dynamics. All this put together results in this emotionally focused romance drama, with strong foundations in character personalities. It's very well built, and the story rewarded me in the end with blissfully wholesome lovey-dovey moments between the couple. However, what I said before is also its most notable downside. Because of how it's all written, between the conservative passive personalities, the style of the prose, and the lack of a motivating conflict at times, the actual progression of the story feels painfully slow at times. Like, you'll see the characters acknowledging that they like the other person, but won't fully commit to telling them because of some fear stopping them. It's very justified, but it also feels like it drags out for an hour or so. And yet, it's seeing this meticulous build-up that makes me appreciate the characters and the romance even more. Other complaints arise in the form of Sana, a man-hating gremlin in which her slanderous tirade against the main character gets tiresome very quickly, which only makes it that much more amusing and yet satisfying when you get to Muse route. Sana's transformation is such a big character development that I fully believe actually catapulted her to being a fan favorite character, one that eventually got her own route in visual novel. Mashiroiro Symphony Sana Edition is a separate installment, dedicated to Sana alone, and her game is designed to hit you non-stop with adorableness and pure-hearted affection. Not only are Sana's love-struck actions and CGs absolutely worth reading for those wholesome scenes, but watching her overcome her struggle with intimacy and her own self-confidence is well worth it too. It may be a separate installment, but it contains all of the same qualities as the base game. Mashiroiro Symphony is a slow burn romance that showcases the full extent of the relationship, with all of the characters' personal thoughts, feelings, and actions put on display. Mashiroiro Symphony and the Sana edition gets an A. Now, to first set the stage, Nukitashi is known for being an outrageously over-the-top action-sex comedy visual novel. It's about rebels fighting the pro-sex police force with weaponized dildos and onaholes. And you'll be glad to know that its sequel perfectly matches the original, bringing more absurd craziness while also delivering such a passionately wholesome story. If you are unfamiliar with the premise of Nukitashi, the story takes place on Saren Island, a place where open perverted sex is permitted by law. Thanks to this law, tourism and sex-related businesses revive the island from economic ruin. Everyone loves it, except for a select few, and it's those individuals that Nukitashi is all about, as these rebels seek to destroy the perverted sex law. Now, you might think that this is a sex-heavy game, and a lot of people do have sex in here in mentioning. However, Nukitashi also told a much deeper story about suppressed individuals fighting against this hidden dystopian world. Our main characters are fighting because the people they care about are negatively affected by this law. For example, our main character Junosuke fights to protect his sister because this society doesn't acknowledge her homosexuality, which will eventually force her to have intercourse with guys. Nukitashi is an absurdist comedy-heavy visual novel, yes, but it's also surprisingly weighty and meaningful too. Nukitashi 2 gives you the same experience, but here the story chooses to focus on the villain heroines from the first game, and I'm a really big fan of this. All of them are just as interesting and attractive as the main heroines. Actually getting to see their own personal backstories and learning why they are on the side of the government is compelling, because as Junosuke continues to bond with them, it allows us to see their internal struggles and the contradictions they've had to face. They are people who had to behave without anyone truly knowing who they are as a person beyond their police enforcing status. All of these girls are charismatic and charming in their own right. Toka is one extraordinary but cute, dysfunctional autistic girl. Rei is one hell of a sergeant and yet embarrassingly messy maiden, and Ikuko still remains to be my favorite precious, lovingly adorable slut. Of course, Junosuke himself continues to shine in the spotlight. Nukitashi 2 may have a weird concept to start off with, but it further explores him in the original cast while reinforcing the original game's concepts. In fact, this sequel actually goes even further, tackling LGBT+ elements in its messages and characters. Honestly, one of its most shining and strongest qualities. That said, Nukitashi 2 isn't perfect or for everyone. Really, the mileage you can get out of this depends on whether or not you're on board with Nukitashi as a premise or its overly absurdist humor and crass jokes. But if anything I just said before about Nukitashi was even somewhat interesting or amusing, I would highly encourage you to go check it out for yourself. It's quite an experience. Nukitashi 2 gets an A. Next up is a famous, classic visual novel, at least among a certain group of fans. For this title stands apart as one of the most popular Nukigay titles out there, the game that helped popularize Monster Girls, Monster Girl Quest. Now, while Monster Girl Quest is an Ero RPG about being devoured by powerful, dominating monster girls if you lose in battle, it's also a surprisingly phenomenal story about one hero's dream to create a world where monsters and humans live together peacefully. Really, this title is what it truly means to come for the plot and stay for the plot. In the world of Monster Girl Quest, monster girls tend to be hostile towards humans and are led by the Monster Lord. Luca, our young protagonist, sets out on a journey to defeat the Monster Lord and hopefully stop the fighting. But on the day of his hero's baptism, he helps an unconscious Lamia girl, unfortunately missing out on his ceremony. The monster girl named Alice mocks Luca's dream of monster-human coexistence, but to his surprise, decides to join him anyway as he sets out on his journey. But what Luca didn't realize is that the female Lamia right beside him is the very Monster Lord herself. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, this game is upfront about what it is all about. Domineering monster girls who want to assert their power over our boy Luca. Every monster in here is unique and varied in design and in how they will capture and milk him for all he's worth. These H-scenes is monster femdom with every kink imaginable, with the worst monsters straight up voring him. To those of you that are into this type of rough punishment via monster girls, whether it's plants, animals, inanimate objects, or eldritch abominations, I honestly can't think of any greater title than this. But despite its spicy content, I for sure wasn't expecting an actual great story to come out of this. Monster Girl Quest is the story premise of interracial problems between humans and monsters taken to its max potential. Every town/place that Luca and Alice end up visiting on their adventure offers its own unique issues around the race dynamic. From witch girls using innocent people in their experiments, to elves and fairies seeking to reclaim their original territory from the humans, to a king exploiting ant girls for grueling labor. Each situation that Luca and Alice face questions if monster-human coexistence can even work at all, because as you'll see, some of the individuals that they meet have very deeply rooted racial biases and grudges. But it's through Luca's perseverance and optimistic nature that they end up changing for the better. However, it's not just them. Luca and Alice too also learn and grow from their adventure. Luca eventually comes to understand that the world isn't as simple as he originally thought, as he confronts situations that make him question and reconsider his own principles. Meanwhile, Alice has her own personal insecurities to deal with, which is just one of the many ways the story highlights the idea of people being burdened by their past predecessors and their passed down beliefs. That character development is something worth watching. It made for some really impactful moments, especially when these characters are resolved to fight for what they believe in. The gameplay might be this simple turn-based RPG, but there are some hype as hell fights in here, and given Luca's reason to fight, it gives the battle so much more meaning. Monster Girl Quest is an indecent title, and it's not ashamed in telling you that, but just like what happens in this title, when you disregard those initial biases and look much deeper, you'll find a visual novel with great likable characters, genuine heartwarming moments, and an aspiring, moving message about monster-human coexistence. And I'm not the only one, as plenty of fans will vouch for how unexpected and yet great this game is. Monster Girl Quest gets an A. Studio Key is known for their emotional visual novel stories, especially if it involves robot girls. And out of all of them, Stella of the End is their best one yet. Turns out, taking a cynical man who's experienced the harsh realities of a ruined world and pairing him up with a young, bubbly female android is a winning formula. The story follows Jude, an expert courier whose job is to transport goods and supplies. And on one particular day, he accepts a job from one affluent old man to track down and deliver one very special package to him. But what Jude found was a very strange android girl who wants to become human. It was at this point he realized this wasn't any ordinary delivery, it was an escort mission. Out of all the short key visual novels, this one is the title I was most anticipated for, and is now my personal favorite out of the bunch. I love the visual style, the rugged yet vibrant colors of a post-apocalyptic world, and yet it still adheres to that techno aesthetic. But the biggest thing that stood out was this forced companionship between this veteran survivalist and this innocent wannabe human robot. Through their interactions, it builds the world around them and shows you how they see it. Jude's jaded survivalist pragmatism versus Philia's human-oriented idealistic optimism. Seeing their beliefs clash creates interesting, thought-provoking discussions about humanity, technology, and the qualities of being human, all taking place in this post-apocalyptic world with plenty of dangers on their journey. Some people might find Stella the End to be predictable. It is, after all, a Key visual novel with a robot heroine. Given Key's iconic brand of storytelling, it's easy to see where things are going to end up. However, I argue it's not the end result that you should be focusing on, but rather the journey of these two characters, human and robot, that eventually becomes this teacher-student and even father-daughter dynamic. I enjoy seeing them together through all of their thought-provoking, comedic, and even tense scenes. It's a really convincing and compelling relationship, and as the two slowly reaches their destination, you get to see that their journey is not only a physical one, but a deeply personal one too. Questions begin to arise, contradictions comes into suspect, and their awareness of the situation begins to change. Wondering how their future will play out was foreboding for sure, but I very much was invested to see what would happen. And it all leads to a satisfying ending, one with all the familiar quirks and emotional highs of a Studio Key title. A very high recommendation for a short visual novel written by Romeo Tanaka. A tier. Now, many people have probably heard of the popular sci-fi title Steins Gate, but what you might not know is the psychological horror series that started before Steins Gate, the Chaos series. And I want to tell you about one special title in particular, a story where we see a high schooler wannabe journalist pursuing a serial murder case, only to realize that the case was pursuing him instead, Chaos Child. This is one hell of a psychological murder mystery, one that gave me a lot of emotional grief reading it, and yet it might be the boldest science adventure story I will ever read. Taking place 6 years after the events of its predecessor, Chaos Head, Takeru Miyashiro investigates a rather mysterious murder case. However, he figures out very quickly that this death was the first in a series of odd killings that would mark the return of the new generation murders, an unusual string of murder incidents that threw the city of Shibuya into chaos 6 years ago. As the sequel to Chaos Head, it expands a lot on the concepts from its predecessor, from the psychological delusion trigger, to its unnerving horror sequences, to even its controversial main character, all while still presenting something fresh in its story. Here in Chaos Child, the story acts more like a thriller murder mystery rather than Chaos Head's psychological Denpa horror experience. And yet, Chaos Child is still just as horrifying. Perhaps to some, even more scarring. Most of the nightmarish horror aspects come from the elaborate sequences leading up to the murders and our cast getting into situations where they clearly shouldn't be. It's a serial murder case, but our main character Takeru can't help but get more curious and eager to solve the mystery, not fully realizing how dangerous it actually is, which ultimately leads to serious consequences for him and his family and friends. It was a really interesting read, because what I expected from Chaos Child was a psychological Denpa horror just like in Chaos Head, but what I experienced instead was a found family drama. This story created likable characters that I grew to care about a lot. Every one of them deals with their own struggles and traumas, not to mention the collective PTSD from the tragedy that happened in Chaos Head. Seeing them come together and interact in their small little newspaper club was wholesome and enjoyable. And then the story proceeded to put those lives at risk. The amount of fear and agony I felt watching everything happen was astounding. What's also special about Chaos Child 2 is its depth in world building. Each of the games in the Science Adventure series has their own focus on different science fiction themes. The Chaos series in particular likes to combine elements of real-world science and technology with a dash of chuny sci-fi fantasy. While some of the intricate technological details may just pass by to anyone not super invested in those topics, the core ideas are still clear. Here, it's used to explore each of the characters and their mental state more deeply, and I've always appreciated that. The Chaos series focuses on the concept of perception, identifying what's real and what's a delusion. Chaos Child in particular tackles that topic in relation to online media. It talks about how people in society engage with information online, choosing to believe in what news is presented to us or choosing to reject it altogether, regardless if the information is truthful or not. It's kinda mind-blowing how ambitious Chaos Child's thematic ideas and commentary can get. It left such a lasting impression on me and how I see the world, especially considering how it feels so relevant today. And this game was developed in 2014. Overall, reading Chaos Child was an emotional thrill ride in many ways. Mixed feelings, both good and bad. It still has some of the same pitfalls as Chaos Head did in its mixed route quality and questionable scenes, but I honestly think that this is a story I can never re-experience again with the same emotions I did reading it for the first time. Top recommendation, A tier. Side note, if you do get the visual novel, I would highly recommend downloading the Committee of Zero patch for the game. There's even a spoiler-free guide to all the routes on the website where the patch is, which I found very helpful to quickly navigate through all the routes to unlock the true ending. Meikei no Lupercalia is a hidden gem visual novel, and I would highly recommend it if you're looking for a character-driven drama title. But if there's one thing I would ask you to read for it first, it's for the showstopper vocal performances.
お前だってやはり罪があるのだ。誰一人として罪のない者はいないというこの世界で。裁判官もいないというのに、誰が一体この俺に罪の宣告をするというのだ。
The stage plays are absolutely captivating. It's so bold and full of personality. In one instance, you'll see a calm, collected, and yet curious individual speak like a murderous psychopath. And in another, you'll see a cheeky, flirtatious girl turn into a furious ball of unbridled rage. It's just so astounding to watch, and even more meaningful considering how dedicated these characters are to the theater world in order to prove themselves and how far they're willing to go. The story of Meikei no Lupercalia begins when the young actress prodigy Hyoko Orihara conquered the theater world with her unrivaled talent. But at the peak of her career, Hyoko dedicated her life to giving the ultimate performance, resulting in her dying on stage. Many years later, during a freshman welcome party, Tamaki Sewa stumbles upon a student theater group's surprise performance, to which then he is immediately recruited to help him out. As he helps coach their performers, Tamaki is forced to confront his troubled past and his lingering feelings regarding Hyoko's legendary final act as a former child prodigy who abandoned the theater world. Now, you might pass on this visual novel thinking that theater is not for you or is not interesting. However, Meikei no Lupercalia goes beyond the premise of theater plays and performers, but rather, what does it mean to pursue the absolute top, to perform at the highest standards of any artistic or competitive field, and the insecurities and consequences that come with it. We get to see how each character handles their emotions through their introspective monologues, only to then see how they are forced to confront the ugly truths, the contrast between pure talent and hard work, the meaning behind genuine passion and innocent enthusiasm, and the sacrifices it takes to pursue absolute perfection. It's a very personal, reflective deep dive, and I very much enjoyed that breakdown. However, not only does Meikei no Lupercalia explore this through spotlighting its complex cast of characters, but by going a step farther, involving multi-layered allegories, unreliable narration, and meta plot twists that fundamentally changes your entire perspective. I would love to go into this way more, but I don't want to. This is a title where I would highly recommend you go in blind, because it's totally worth it to see the plot twists happen in real time, as it opens your eyes on previously known story parallels now having some pretty devastating implications. Even how it handles heroine routes is done in a very unique way, and the greatest thing about all of that is how it's meant to further present extra layers of character conflict and development. That said, the story gets pretty damn depressing. It likes to pile unfortunate circumstances one after another, but at the end of the day, it does so in order to present one really grandiose story, where after experiencing countless tragedies very Shakespearean-like in accordance to its theater premise, seeing these characters overcome them is just so cathartic. This visual novel is very much a personal favorite, and it's very me-coded, which is why Meikei no Lupercalia gets an S from me. If you've been with me and the channel for a while and you like my specific taste in visual novels, that is, emotionally gripping, character-focused dramas, I can say this title will not disappoint. Let me start off by saying that this title is the only visual novel that has placed itself on Metacritic's list of best games of all time, standing among legendary giants like Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Grand Theft Auto V, and Elden Ring. And that title is The House in Fata Morgana, a fantastic, artistic, emotionally pulling visual novel worthy of its high ratings. It begins as you, the reader, wake up in an old gothic mansion with no memories. You meet a mysterious maid and she takes you on a journey through the mansion's history. Door by door, she takes you through different time periods to see the unique stories of the mansion's past residents and the cursed tragedy that has befallen every single one of them, in the hopes that by witnessing their tragedies, you will be able to regain your memories. The House in Fata Morgana is a drama mystery, fully intent on exploring its complex cast of characters. Each tale ends in tragedy, and the story wants you to figure out how it ended up that way, all while deceiving you along the way and hitting you where it hurts. I felt like this visual novel and its writers were playfully messing with me with its script. It's very good at misdirecting the reader and delivering its clever plot twists. I was very caught off guard by some of the surprise reveals, but what's special about it is how it continued to leave a lasting impression once I realized how it all connected together, and when I took pity on these tragic characters. No matter what time period the story takes you through, from the Middle Ages to the Industrial Age, all of them deal with the darkest aspects of human nature: serial murder, domestic abuse, sexual violence, and human trafficking. The story doesn't shy away from talking about these topics. It handles it all in a respectful manner, as we get an intimate look into each character's thoughts and feelings from all sides. Reading how they handle their situation makes us see them as morally reprehensible, and yet also deeply relatable and very human. It's an impressive mark of quality when the story makes us deeply sympathetic to its hateful characters. Like, just reading about this particular man made me deeply conflicted on how I feel about him, even at the very end. What's also nice about The House in Fata Morgana is that I would highly recommend reading this if you're looking for a visual novel outside of the anime visual aesthetic. The presentation is just fantastic. Everything from the classical lyrical soundtrack to the vivid atmospheric visuals to the realistic looking characters is an absolute treat. Perfect for instilling that sense of mood and atmosphere to immerse you into the lives of these characters, no matter what time period you're in. For PC players in particular, I would highly recommend downloading the Remade of Dreams patch, which transforms the PC version of the game into the Dreams of Revenant edition for the PS4 and the Nintendo Switch. The House in Fata Morgana is a title worthy of its critical acclaim and one I would highly recommend for everyone to read, not just visual novel fans. S tier. Now I'm gonna start this off by saying that Kara no Shoujo 2 is my favorite murder mystery of all time. Kara no Shoujo combines this haunting, atmospheric aesthetic where women are crucified in accordance to a local cult legend with its Japanese noir investigation narrative. It's not just about finding the serial murder, but rather exploring the madness that comes from obsessions and paranoia. I gave Kara no Shoujo 1 a B in my 2022 yearly review video. I thought the story, characters, and presentation was excellent. Everything from the flow of the mystery to the focus on the emotional grief and insecurities of its cast to the somber, jaded atmosphere all nicely fit together. My main problems was that it was easy to miss key information and land in a bad ending, and the fact that it had two separate mysteries that ended up splitting your investment. Kara no Shoujo 2 makes the former easier and fixes the latter, while still improving every great quality from the first game. The story follows Tokisaka Reiji as he tasked with investigating a series of murders in a 1950s Tokyo, the victims being young women with their wombs torn and stuffed with clay dolls. And at the center of this mystery is a very depressed man who failed to off himself, an individual with one very complicated history. In comparison to the first installment, Kara no Shoujo 2 has one central mystery, one that gets more complicated and complex the deeper the investigation goes. We switch back and forth between two different time periods, we get to investigate a complicated family family drama, and we get to see a backwater isolated village with a very stubborn cult legend. People may shrug at the slow starting slice of life in the beginning, but it was a build-up I found myself strangely invested into, only realized when people started dying and I see the people related to them develop life-altering traumas. After all, the victims depicted in here are shown in ghastly, sickly ways, tamer than the gory depictions in the first game, but this story is still grim and cruel. What's also great about Karano Shoujo 2 is that Reiji is still a fantastic character to watch. He's a damn good detective, and he's pretty sarcastic and witty when it comes to the endlessly teasing women around him. But he's also got that sensitive, anguish side, as he's still suffering in his desperate search of a girl very important to him. His assistant, the dual protagonist Masaki, is also gripping to watch. The dude is put through the emotional ringer with every murder and secret revealed to him, whether he likes it or not. Really, both of these guys were great to watch tackling this murder case. Karano Shoujo 2's mystery is one complicated puzzle, and it only gets more complex the deeper the investigation goes. And yet, it's absolutely amazing how everything manages to piece itself together, while still leaving room for that brutal, bittersweet sequel hook. This was a story I just could not put down at the last act. It was just that captivating. It's dark, depressing, bittersweet, and tragic, but it's one damn good detective story with great characters. Top tier recommendation, S tier. This may be the second part in the trilogy, but this installment alone was worth reading regardless. In the year 2000, Kinoko Nasu and Takashi Takeuchi released a heavily beloved story and legendary cult classic among visual novels. 20 years later, they would end up remaking this title to be released worldwide, Tsukihime, A Piece of Blue Glass Moon. And this remake is Type Moon's core roots taken to its highest potential. The story is about a boy named Shiki Tono who has the ability to see lines of death on objects and living beings. Lines that, when cut, can destroy them completely. After surviving a near-fatal accident as a child, Shiki gained this mysterious power, which he struggles to control. Shiki returns to the Tono family mansion after years of living with his relatives. However, his life takes a turn for the worst as he gets wrapped up in a series of vampire-like murders after his meeting with a mysterious yet beautiful woman. Without any exaggeration, Tsukihime Remake is a full showcase of Kinoko Nasu's writing abilities, both in technical depth and genre spread. From intense thrilling action to unsettling horror to ordinary slice of life, it's impressive how masterful his writing skill is. Battle scenes are constructed with this poetic elegance and fantasy lore to create this feeling of exciting, thrilling hype. Horror scenes are nightmarish to watch at times, both psychologically and externally. Even the day scenes contain this sense of peaceful normalcy, something very critical to the story and characters despite the vampire thriller mystery narrative. And it's all taken to its utmost potential thanks to its stellar cinematography and soundtrack. Tsukihime Remake is basically what you think of when you imagine a AAA visual novel title. If you thought Type Moon's other work, which on the Holy Night was a cinematic spectacle, you'll find Tsukihime Remake absolutely stunning. Type Moon set the highest bar for visual novels and then raised it even higher. You'll get to experience some bombastic fights, horrifyingly gruesome scenes, and even some meaningful heart-to-heart character moments. I read the original Tsukihime visual novel, and reading the remake only made me fall in love with the characters even more. I absolutely fell hard for Arcoade, and CL is just a super cool senpai. Speaking of, CL's route from the original story has been largely rewritten, greatly to its benefit too. While it's written differently from Arcoade's route and establishes more in-depth universe lore, it also goes absolutely bananas. The final few hours of CL's route quite literally takes things to grand epic proportions. Of course, Tsukihime, A Piece of Blue Glass Moon, isn't flawless. This game only contains Arcoade and CL's routes, leaving out Akiha, Hisui, and Kohaku's route for its sequel title. As a result, they and certain side characters end up largely underutilized. There's also Nasu's typical writing habit of being long-winded with his info dump scenes, lore breakdowns, and even fight scenes. Although, this negative is entirely subjective, as your mileage may vary. Tsukihime, A Piece of Blue Glass Moon is one of the best visual novel experiences out there. A top tier recommendation, S tier. Now, before we move on to the next segment, I would like to give the spotlight to an honorable mention. A game that would 100% take the spot for the category of personal favorite in a heartbeat, if it weren't for its format. A visual novel hybrid between an eroge and a fantasy RPG. A title where after 1,000 years, on the verge of extinction, demons rise up against mankind in one final struggle for survival, and along the way, kicking slavery's ass. Demon's Roots. Without a doubt, this game is one of the best RPGs I've ever played. The story is one hell of an epic, and it absolutely kicks ass. Sure, the premise might sound like your typical ordeal of demons versus humans in an RPG Maker game, but this title had me fully committing emotionally. I can pinpoint the exact moment where it happened too, and from that point on, I was convinced I picked up a damn good game. Not only are there plenty of passionate hype moments, there's a lot of twists and turns as the story constantly moves forward, keeping you on your toes every step of the way. Every plot twist it threw at me constantly switched between being jaw-dropping and heartbreaking, and it earned those reactions. The main cast of characters are extremely lovable, well-written, and have fantastic chemistry between each other. I just love how intimate they all feel together. They are a party that will get you invested into them, both in their proud victories and doomed hopelessness, especially as you follow its main lead, the charismatic plant demon Death Polka. Over the course of the story, you watch Death Polka as she leads the demons in their invasion of the human world. Under her leadership, they rise up and fight against the human empire, not out of revenge, but for the sake of their freedom, survival, and even peaceful coexistence. Morally, this arguably justifies the demons as the good guys. We get to understand their pain and struggle and the emotions driving them to this point. They might be demons, but I found myself deeply sympathizing and rooting for their cause. And when they meet a class of human slaves arguably in the same position, it's hard not to like them. Even if some of the demon generals and slaves are divided or even hopeless in their future, it's Death Polka's sheer charisma and determination in her goal that makes them believe in her. There's something naturally compelling about the weak fighting against the strong and hoping for a better future for their people. Demon's Roots does it with grace and kick-ass passion. It's also a very interesting game too. While it's about the grand epic clash between humans and demons, it's also an exploration of slavery, where it takes the concept of slavery, arguably more about the divide and conflict between the upper class and the lower class, and pushes it to its max story potential, exploring different societies, scenarios, and personal circumstances. Demons may be beneath humans, but with how the ruthless human empire treats its human slaves and establishes their mighty sovereignty over the continent and its nations, demons and slaves aren't all that different. The leader of the demon army might have invaded the human realm, but she sure as hell ain't gonna look away from the weak being trampled and abused. Now, as I've said before, Demon's Roots is not only an RPG, but also an eroge with R18 scenes, some of them depicting characters in very rough BDSM acts. That said, you do have the ability to skip the R18 content altogether. However, Demon's Roots does not shy away from describing the twisted, inhumane acts that the ruthless human empire does. The absolute worst being contained in the bad end mode. It's one hell of a motivating factor to avoid losing and to root for Death Polka and the girls. They are fighting for their freedom with their lives on the line, all while absolute banger tracks play in the background for the big boss fights. The best songs in here, by far, are the battle songs, aka the original tracks from Shade, the main composer behind Alisoft's games, like Sengoku Rans. If you're a big fan of those games, you definitely want to check out Demon's Roots. But in general, I think everyone should play this game if you're a fan of RPGs, and aren't immediately turned away by this being an eroge. To put it simply, Demon's Roots has soul, and dare I say, it might be my favorite RPG of all time. Now, it is technically a sequel to King Exit, but even without prior knowledge, it still didn't take away my enjoyment of this game. You should play it. I'll even put links down below. You will not regret it. And now it's time for the lightning round of interesting visual novels worth checking out released this year that I, unfortunately, was not able to get to. First up is the biggest VN release news this year. Fate Stay Night, Type Moon's most iconic visual novel, is now available to purchase on Steam and the Nintendo Switch. Enjoy this remastered edition of the classic Fate Stay Night story that started the Fate series and its large catalog of spin-off media. But that's not the only thing, as Type Moon has also announced an official translation of the Fate Stay Night Hollow Ataraxy visual novel coming soon. Meanwhile, if you're a fan of the critically acclaimed cult classic Wonderful Everyday, Down the Rabbit Hole, or Subarashi Hibi, you might want to consider checking out its story origins in the Sui no Sora remake, which got a fan translation earlier this year. Fans of the Ace Attorney series are going to be glad to know that the Apollo Justice Trilogy and the Ace Attorney Investigations collection is now available to purchase on PC and the Nintendo Switch. Meanwhile, if you're looking for a brand new mystery visual novel to read, consider checking out the Famicom Detective Club Emio, the Smiling Man. Aniplex.ex, the publisher company behind Achi My Dear Moments, released a new visual novel called Seeso Lullaby, where three 16-year-olds, three generations of the same family, set off on an adventure through the land of gods. The highly influential and emotionally powerful visual novel Katawa Shoujo, which follows a young man as he meets 5 girls with various disabilities, is now available to play on Steam, where it remains completely free to play. For those who love slow, wholesome vanilla romances, Geniro Haruka is now available to read through a fan translation. If you enjoyed Hoshiori Yume Mirai, Geniro Haruka is from the same developers. If you're looking for a more extreme horror visual novel to check out, Dead Days might be up your alley. Just a warning though, as it might be another rough experience, given it's from Clockup, the same developers behind Euphoria and Maggot Baits. Looking for a coming-of-age story? Consider checking out Since Memories Off the Starry Sky, a story about a college student renovating a Japanese manor after mourning the loss of his brother, in which a mysterious girl tells him that he should have been the one to die. For veteran fans of the Memories Off series, this title is a successor set 10 years after the original series. For drama fans, I would recommend 2 titles. The first is Everlasting Flowers, a heartfelt slice-of-life drama from Sprite, the developers behind Aokana. It follows 2 girls who spend the summer working together at a seaside lodge, healing their wounded hearts along the way. The second is Kimaga Nozumu Ien, an emotional romance drama, a title that also serves as a spiritual precursor to the Muv-Luv series. And lastly, while its sudden release may have caught key fans off guard, an HD release of the classic visual novel Kanan is now available to purchase on Steam. However, key fans are more likely familiar with the news that the studio's latest title, Heaven Burns Red, is now available to play worldwide, to which many active players and key fans I've heard from is another amazing story experience. All thanks to Jun Maeda, the creator of Angel Beats, Little Busters, and Clanad. And now it's time for the category winners for 2024. I'm choosing to be a bit more flexible this year with the winners in order to offer multiple options, in case people were looking for a particular feel in a particular genre. What do I mean by this? Well, let's start off with the winners of Best Romance, Mashiroiro Symphony, and The House in Fata Morgana. For those looking for a more wholesome vanilla anime-styled romance, Mashiroiro Symphony and the Sana edition will do you very well. It's got that familiar anime vibe to it, the classic boy meets girl plotline. It's very simple in its execution, but when done right, can be very effective. What I love is just how compassionate these characters can be for each other, and yet that can also turn into a problem. They're all kind-hearted in their own unique ways, but they can't see how their intense dedication hurts themselves in the process. Their partner ends up recognizing that, gets upset by it, and strives to help them in the best way that they can. Mashiroiro Symphony's script highlights these emotions in such an introspective, reflective way, fully showcasing both the struggle and passion behind those feelings. It's an anime romance story that I just loved reading, seeing how these characters grow because of their relationship. For those looking for a more serious-oriented romance without the anime eccentricities and tropes, The House in Fata Morgana is the one you should check out. As the story continues, we, the readers, see these characters naturally hide the darker parts of themselves, shamed to open up, either because of their personal insecurities or how society views them as individuals. It leads them to lash out in hateful ways, but when that certain someone reaches across being genuinely kind, caring, and understanding, it can help heal that person suffering inside. Just a a simple act of compassion can mean the world to them. Romance is a very prominent element in the house and Fata Morgana. As much as I love the cute romantic moments between the couples, the sheer spirit of compassion from these partners going at lengths for each other and even other people close to them is just so admiring and awe-inspiring. And now, next up are the winners for the best beginner visual novels. Visual novels I would recommend playing to get a feel for what visual novels has to offer as a medium. And those two are Slay the Princess and Paranormasight. Really, any one of these two could fit. Again, it's all about preference, really. If you want a more creative, unique, personalized experience, Slay the Princess will satisfy you, offering a choose-your-own-adventure story with many amusing story variations along the way. If you want a more traditional story narrative with a bit of gameplay to it, Paranormasight works here, taking you through an investigative mystery that's very character-driven. Both games are short enough for a quick read while still being a very fulfilling reading experience. They nail their atmosphere and vibe very easily and are entertaining in their own unique ways. They also are very accessible too, being available on PC and console platforms. And I guess if you need more credentials behind them, both games have their support from just a couple of small YouTubers. While they may not be the super traditional visual novels you've seen throughout this video, I still believe that hybrid gameplay visual novels are a good way to ease new visitors into the medium. Certainly better than slapping them with a 60+ hour VN like Fate Stay Night or Umineko. But I mean, some people may actually like that. But anyway, moving on to Best Horror, which coincidentally is one of these two titles. The winner for Best Horror is Slay the Princess. Slay the Princess wins based on art style alone. There are so many different variations of both the environment and the princess in here, all hand-drawn. Seeing how distinct and unique some of these styles are is just really cool. The Spectre was startling for sure, the Nightmare was creepy as hell, and the Wraith was just impressive alone at the pure build-up and execution of the whole sequence. It even gets a bit gory in some scenes. I can remember the knife being used to cut off the princess's hand, and you can see the blood and bones sticking out of her arm. I'm a fan of how Slay the Princess establishes its atmosphere and tone, all while the narrator does a fantastic job describing these scenes in vivid detail. I would say more about Slay the Princess, but I believe you should go experience the game for yourself to see what it has to offer. There's plenty to explore. Next up is the winner for Best Mystery, and that award goes to Kara no Shoujo 2. I'm a big fan of the noir-esque atmosphere that Kara no Shoujo presents, as well as its overall thematic idea of hyperfixations driving people to act impulsively, based off their tragic circumstances. But as a mystery itself, it had me reading for hours. I just could not put this down as I was fully immersed. It may have one large ensemble cast, coverage of 2 different time periods, and constant perspective changes, but it somehow manages to tie everything together perfectly, while still leaving room for the most brutal, bittersweet sequel hook I've ever read in a visual novel. It's quite an amazing feat. Characters who seem unrelated to the events are ultimately revealed to have very crucial key connections to the case. Seeing the different perspectives allows the reader to get a further insight to figure out this mystery alongside our lead detectives. And while its stubborn characters claim a supernatural curse is at work, the story tells you that these murders are undeniably the work of human hands, no matter how tangled and strange this web of mysteries is. It just requires more investigation, no matter who or what you have to trample upon. I could spot out certain connections and ominous foreshadowing, but I was still very surprised by some of the twists and reveals later on. Pair all of this up with our compelling, capable lead detectives, and you have a damn great story. Them being witty while also hiding their emotionally tortured feelings inside is just the cherry on top for me personally. And now it's time for the winner of my personal favorite visual novel that I read in 2024, and that award goes to Tsukihime, A Piece of Blue Glass Moon. I'm fully aware of my slight bias towards Type Moon, but there's just so many amazing qualities in the Tsukihime remake. I only scratched the surface in its review section in here. Between Nasu, Takeuchi, and the entire team, Type Moon created one amazing piece of work. There's quite a lot I want to praise, from its storytelling to its presentation, and I do so in my actual review video, but I'll take the chance here to spotlight Nasu's writing since it's such a significant part of why I like this visual novel so much. Not only does Nasu write in such a stylistic way that greatly highlights each of the genres in here, action, horror, slice of life, and drama, but I've always been fascinated to see his reoccurring messages about humans in his work. Even when you see these extraordinary supernatural characters, you can see how Nasu uses them to talk about the strength and meaningful qualities of humanity. It's written in such a way that makes us empathize with these characters and even allow us to take away meaningful life lessons to apply to our own lives. All as Takeuchi and the rest of the Type Moon staff presents this in such a wonderful, beautiful, united fashion. The original Tsukihime story was a beloved cult classic for good reason, and Tsukihime Remake is the same heartfelt story, but modernized to perfection as a visual novel masterpiece. And that's everything for the year in 2024. Here are the final results. I know it's been a very long video, but I greatly appreciate you watching, whether it's for a specific segment or the entire thing. If you want to know more about a specific visual novel in particular, their individual reviews are in the description down below, as well as my Patreon if you want to further support what I do here. Many thanks to all the wonderful Patreon members for the support so far and going into the future. 2025 is going to be a great year. I've planned some absolute iconic legends coming up, so look forward to those. But in the meanwhile, consider checking out some of the other previous yearly tier list videos for more visual novel recommendations. Feel free to talk about your opinions about any of the titles I talked about here, or any cool visual novels you've read this year. I would love to hear it. This has been August, and I will see you on the next video.